See, here's the deal. We both talked about having kids, or at least I thought we were on the same page about it. Right after we tied the knot, we started having real conversations about starting a family. She'd go on about wanting 2 or 3 kids, tossing around baby names, and brainstorming nursery themes. She'd spend hours online scrolling through baby clothes and gadgets, dreaming up this whole life with our future kids. Talking about it kind of became our thing, a way to stay close and share excitement about the future. We were all in, ready to dive into this next phase of life together, and honestly, everything felt perfect. But then, life threw us a curveball that I never saw coming. After a few months of trying with no luck, we decided to see a doctor to figure out what was up. Long story short, it was me. My numbers were way too low, and the doctor pretty much said that having kids naturally wasn't in the cards for us. It was a sucker punch, plain and simple. I felt like I'd let her down, like all those dreams we had were just snatched away in a heartbeat. That news hit me like a ton of bricks. I fell into a dark place for a while. Therapy eventually helped me climb out of it, but in the beginning, I was a wreck. At first, she seemed understanding. She'd tell me it didn't matter, that she'd be happy with just the 2 of us. But even early on, something about the way she said it felt off. It was like she gave up on the idea way too easily. One minute she was dreaming about kids, and the next, she acted like she didn't care. Now, I get that people change their minds, but the way she flipped the script so fast didn't sit right with me. She went from gushing over baby names to completely dodging the topic. And it wasn't just that. She started looking at me differently, almost like she resented me. Out of nowhere, she dropped little remarks, stuff she never used to say. Comments about how I wasn't taking care of myself, how I should lose some weight, or be more helpful around the house. Okay, sure, I'd put on a few pounds, but it felt like she was nitpicking, like she was trying to find reasons to put me down. When I brought it up and asked why she was acting this way, she'd wave it off. She'd say I was overreacting or being too sensitive. But I could feel it. Something wasn't right. The woman I married, the one who used to sit with me for hours planning our life, wasn't the same anymore. She wasn't outright mean, but there was a distance, like she'd already checked out emotionally but was still physically there. Eventually, I started to believe her when she said everything was fine. I stopped bringing it up because I didn't want to seem insecure or clingy. A few years went by, and we just sort of existed side by side. Our conversations barely scratched the surface. It felt more like we were roommates than a married couple. I tried suggesting other paths, adoption, surrogacy, but she shut down every idea. She'd say things like, "I'm happy with just us," but it always sounded more like she was trying to convince herself than me. Then, out of the blue, she said she wanted to take a trip with her friends. Now, her going on trips with her friends wasn't anything new. She'd done it a few times before, and I was always cool with it. We were living in Manchester at the time, and she had been talking about visiting the Canada with her friends for a while. I didn't think twice about it because I trusted her. I even helped her pack, made sure she had everything she needed, and drove her to the airport. I remember the last thing she said before she boarded. She turned to me and said, "Thanks for being so supportive." It struck me as odd, like, why was she thanking me? I hadn't done anything out of the ordinary, but she seemed sincere, so I brushed it off as her just being nice. That night, I stayed up late to call her after her flight landed, just to make sure she arrived safely. Her flight was supposed to last about 9 hours, so I kept myself occupied at home, flipping through TV channels, glancing at the clock, and waiting for her to send a quick text saying she'd landed. When I saw online that her flight had arrived, I decided to give her a call to make sure everything was okay. The phone just kept ringing, no answer. I figured she was probably exhausted, maybe headed straight to her hotel and fell asleep, so I didn't dwell on it too much. But then the next morning came, and still, nothing. That uneasy feeling started creeping in, like a knot tightening in my stomach. I tried calling her again, and when she didn't pick up, I sent a few texts, thinking maybe she was busy or her phone was on silent. Hours passed with no reply, and by then, I was full-on panicking. I called her sister to see if she'd heard anything. She hadn't. At that point, I was really starting to spiral. I even reached out to her friends, the one she was supposed to be traveling with, hoping they might know something, or maybe there was a mix-up with her phone. But when I called, they were just as confused as I was. They told me they weren't on the trip. In fact, they were just a couple of blocks away, sipping coffee back at home. That's when the reality of it all smacked me in the face. She wasn't on a girls' trip. She wasn't with her friends. She hadn't gone anywhere. She had just disappeared. I sat there with my phone in hand, feeling like the ground had been pulled out from under me. I couldn't make sense of it. Why would she lie? Why would she just leave without so much as a word? I tried convincing myself it had to be some sort of misunderstanding. Maybe she missed a connecting flight, or there'd been some kind of emergency, and she hadn't been able to reach out. But deep down, I knew better. She'd planned this. Everything, from the whole girls' trip excuse to her sweet, "Thank you for being supportive" line. It had all been part of her plan. I didn't know what to do. It was like I'd been dropped into some awful dream I couldn't wake up from. This wasn't the woman I thought I'd married. She felt like a stranger to me now. Looking back, it all started clicking into place. The way she'd grown distant, stopped talking about our future, and started nitpicking me. She'd been pulling away for a while, and I'd been blind to it. Or maybe I just didn't want to see it. That night, I sat there staring at my phone, waiting for something, anything, a text, a call. But nothing came, and deep down, I knew it wasn't going to. The next morning, I woke up and just lay there, staring at the ceiling, hoping it had all been some bad dream. But when I turned my head and saw her side of the bed empty, reality came crashing down. She was gone. She'd packed up and left. And all those little excuses I clung to the night before, that maybe her phone died, or she got delayed, they didn't hold water anymore. It was obvious she'd made up her mind long before she walked out the door. For the first few days, I was in complete denial. I kept calling her phone, praying I'd hear her voice, waiting for some kind of explanation. I left message after message, half the time not even knowing what to say, just hoping she'd respond. But all I got was silence. And somehow, that made it all feel even worse. It felt like she'd left me to figure out the pieces of a puzzle I didn't even know existed. Like I'd never really known her at all. Her family was as blindsided as I was at first. Her mom had no idea about any of it and hadn't heard from her either. I ended up spending a lot of time at her parents' house, hoping they'd have answers. I think her mom felt sorry for me. She'd let me stay over sometimes, even made me meals when I didn't have the energy to cook. She'd sit and listen as I rambled on about all the things that didn't add up, trying to make sense of how everything had fallen apart so suddenly. Other times, I'd just sit there in complete silence, too numb to speak. I swung back and forth between anger, sadness, and guilt, like a pendulum. I kept asking myself over and over, what had I done to make her leave? Where did I go wrong? Did I miss something along the way? Was there a sign I ignored, or a moment I failed to show her enough love? I found myself replaying every conversation, every argument, searching for clues about what had pushed her to leave. I kept obsessing over how I might have saved our marriage, what I could have done differently. It sounds dramatic, I know, but I couldn't stop. I thought if I could just figure it out, maybe I could make it all right again. I wasn't eating much, barely getting any sleep, and my work started to suffer. People began to notice. They'd ask if I was okay, and I'd brush it off with some vague excuse about personal issues. The idea of admitting my wife had walked out on me without a word, it felt too humiliating. Eventually, I confided in a couple of close friends. They tried their best to distract me, dragging me out of the house, trying to help me move forward. But even when I was with them, my mind was stuck on her. I kept wondering where she was and why I wasn't enough to make her stay. The questions from people who didn't know were some of the hardest to handle. Neighbors, family, friends, even old coworkers would casually ask, "How's married life treating you?" Or, "How's your wife?" Every single time. It felt like reopening a fresh wound. I didn't have the courage to tell them the truth, so I'd force a smile and say everything was great. But the weight of that lie got heavier every time I told it. Therapy turned out to be the lifeline I needed. I'd never gone before, but after months of barely functioning, I knew I couldn't do this alone. I found a therapist and started going every week. Having someone neutral to talk to, someone who didn't know either of us or our history, made a world of difference. I poured out all my anger, my hurt, my sense of betrayal. I talked about the sleepless nights spent replaying everything, trying to make sense of it. The therapist helped me see something I'd been blind to. There wasn't a magic moment that could have changed her decision. Leaving was her choice, not a reflection of my worth. That realization was tough to accept. For the longest time, I'd believed there had to be something wrong with me, something that made her leave. But gradually, I started to see it differently. She'd been distant and cold for a long time, and I just hoped things would somehow get better. I convinced myself that if I tried hard enough, I could keep us together. Letting go of that illusion was painful, but it was necessary. Little by little, I started rebuilding my life. Looking back, I realized I'd lost a big part of myself in our marriage without even noticing. I'd always been the guy who worked hard to make her happy, who put effort into keeping our home comfortable. But now, I had all this empty time on my hands, and I didn't know what to do with it. I started by revisiting hobbies I hadn't touched in years. I went back to the gym, picked up books that had been collecting dust, and even tried my hand at cooking some new recipes. Work also began to improve. At first, I was just going through the motions, barely keeping my head above water. But as I started to feel more like myself again, I put more energy into my job. It became one of the few areas of my life where I felt capable, where I still had some control. I threw myself into my work, putting in extra hours, focusing on the details, and it paid off. Eventually, I got promoted, something that never would have happened if I'd stayed stuck in my grief. That's not to say there weren't tough days. Sometimes, I'd stumble across something that reminded me of her. A photo, an old movie ticket, little keepsakes from the life we'd shared. Each one would stir up memories I'd been trying to forget. In those moments, I'd wonder what she was doing, whether she ever thought of me, or if she regretted leaving. But as time went on, those thoughts started losing their grip on me. Each time, it became a little easier to put those memories away and move forward. I also started reconnecting with friends I hadn't seen much since I got married. We started doing things again, hitting up the golf range, going for hikes, and all those activities I hadn't done in years. It felt good to have friends who had nothing to do with the mess I'd been through, people who could pull me forward instead of dragging me back into the pain. Looking back, I realized just how much of myself I'd poured into that relationship. Being her husband had consumed so much of who I was that when she left, it felt like she'd taken a huge part of me with her. But little by little, I started finding myself again. It wasn't a fast process, and it definitely wasn't easy, but I was making progress. By the time the year ended, I could finally look in the mirror and see someone who wasn't defined by what she'd done. I wasn't just the guy who got left behind. I was someone who had survived, rebuilt, and come out stronger. For the first time in ages, I felt like I could live my life without her shadow looming over me. And honestly, I was proud of that. I thought I'd moved on completely. Life finally felt normal again. Well, as normal as it could be after everything. I had a solid routine, good friends to keep me busy, and work was going better than ever. I wasn't thinking about her every day anymore. Sure, every now and then, a random memory would sneak up on me, but it wasn't like before when she seemed to haunt every second of my life. So, when I heard a knock on my door one Saturday morning, she was the last person I expected to see standing there. But there she was, right on my doorstep, holding a baby. I froze. My brain just stopped for a second. It felt like I was staring at a ghost. She looked almost the same, maybe a little more tired, but still her. And then she gave me this look, like she honestly believed I'd be happy to see her. And yeah, that messed me up. I thought I'd buried those feelings, but seeing her again brought back a flood of emotions I wasn't ready for. I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there, dumbfounded. She smiled at me, like nothing had ever happened. Then, as if she had every right in the world, she asked, "Can I come in?" The audacity. After everything she'd done, she just shows up, expecting me to welcome her back like nothing had changed. But I held it together. I told her, "No, you can stay right there and explain." There was no way I was letting her into my house. This was my space now, the place I'd rebuilt for myself, free of the chaos she'd left behind. She looked a little thrown off by my response but stayed put and launched into her story. She started with, "I know this might be a shock, but I wanted to come back and explain everything." Her face had this hopeful expression, like she genuinely thought I'd be open to hearing her out. I was caught between slamming the door in her face and laughing at the absurdity of it all. But curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to hear what excuse she had for vanishing the way she did. She went on about how leaving had been a mistake, how she'd realized she'd lost the best thing that had ever happened to her. Her words, not mine. She said she'd done a lot of soul-searching and that, after having this baby, she finally understood what really mattered in life. Apparently, what mattered was showing up unannounced at my doorstep after ghosting me for years. Then she looked down at the baby and said, "This is our second chance." I couldn't believe the nerve of her. A second chance? Like this baby was supposed to magically erase the past and let us start over like nothing had happened. I kept my face as calm as I could, but inside, I was furious. She kept talking, saying she wanted us to be a family again, that she'd made a huge mistake, and now we could start fresh, the three of us. Finally, I asked the one question that had been burning in my mind since the moment I saw her. "Why did you leave?" I tried to keep my voice steady, but I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold it together. I'd spent years torturing myself, trying to figure out why she left, running through every possible reason. Now that she was standing there, I needed to hear it straight from her. She hesitated, her eyes dropping to the ground like she was ashamed, but eventually, she started talking. Whether it was the truth or not, I'll never know for sure. She admitted she'd left because she wanted a child, and since I couldn't give her one, she found someone else who could. She said it like it was no big deal, like she hadn't completely destroyed my life. It was as if she expected me to just nod and go along with it. She explained that the guy she'd run off with didn't stick around, but by then, she'd had the baby and decided she wanted me back. Just like that. Simple as flipping a switch. I stood there, letting her words sink in. Here she was, openly admitting that she'd abandoned me, ran off with another man, had his baby, and now thought she could come back as if nothing had happened. I looked her in the eye and said, "So, let me get this straight. You left, found someone else, had his kid, and now you think you can just come back and pretend none of it happened?" That's when the tears started. She began sobbing, saying she was sorry, that she'd made a huge mistake. But honestly, her tears didn't move me. I felt nothing. She kept going, telling me how she'd realized I was the one she truly loved, that we were meant to be together. It was hard not to laugh at how absurd she sounded. This wasn't love. It was desperation, plain and simple, and it was written all over her face. Then she shifted gears, trying to guilt-trip me. She started talking about how hard it was to be a single mom, how much she'd struggled. She tried painting herself as the victim, like she hadn't made every choice that led her to this moment. She told me she needed my help, that she was ready to fix things and make it work this time. The whole time, one thought kept running through my head. Who does she think I am? I let her talk, but I was done listening. Finally, I looked at her and said, "You made your choice a long time ago. Now you have to live with it. There's no second chance here." She looked stunned, like it had never even crossed her mind that I might say no, like she genuinely believed she could just stroll back into my life because it suited her. But then, instead of leaving, she got angry. Her voice rose, and she started yelling, calling me selfish, saying I owed her a chance to make things right. She even brought up how she could have divorced me back then and taken half of everything. She had the audacity to bring up the house, claiming it should still be hers. It was like a mask had come off, and I was finally seeing her for who she really was. I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice. I just looked at her and said, "We're done. You chose a different life, and now you have it. This isn't my problem anymore." Then I shut the door in her face, cutting off whatever final words she might have had. Standing there, I could still hear her muffled shouts on the other side, but I felt this calm settle over me. She could yell, knock, cry, whatever she wanted, but I knew I wasn't letting her back into my life. The woman I married? She was gone. In her place was this stranger who thought she could swoop in and pick up the pieces when it was convenient for her. I walked away from the door and sat down, feeling lighter than I had in years. I thought that was the end of it, that she'd finally get the message and leave. But I was wrong. She started pounding on the door, yelling all kinds of nonsense. The nerve of it all, standing there, demanding I listen to her, in the very space I'd rebuilt after the wreckage she left behind. At first, I figured I'd ignore her, let her scream until she got tired. But curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to hear what excuse she'd come up with this time. So, I went back to the door and opened it, just a crack. Just enough to let her see I was there, but not enough to let her in. She looked like I'd slapped her, clearly stunned that I hadn't given her the reaction she was expecting. Then she launched into this over-the-top monologue about how she was willing to forgive me for slamming the door in her face and how she was ready to start fresh. Like we'd had some petty argument and not a complete betrayal of trust. She kept rambling about how we could make it work if we both just tried harder. I couldn't help myself. I laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a full-on laugh. The sheer audacity of this woman was beyond anything I'd ever seen. Her face twisted with anger, like I was the one being unreasonable for not taking her seriously. I told her, "You left. You had your chance, and you threw it away. You don't get to just show up and expect me to forget all of that because it's convenient for you." Her face went beet red, and she started spewing excuses about how hard things had been for her. She claimed she'd been lost after leaving and that she'd realized, far too late, that she'd made a mistake. But I wasn't having any of it. I looked her straight in the eye and said, "Leaving was your decision. You planned it, lied about it, and went through with it. Whatever regrets you have now don't change a thing." That's when she lost it. The sad, remorseful act disappeared, and she launched into a tirade. She accused me of being unfair, said I didn't even have the decency to give her another chance. And then she dropped the real kicker. "If I'd wanted to, I could have taken everything from you back then. Half of everything you own could have been mine." I stood there, speechless for a moment, not because I was surprised, but because I was amazed at her audacity. This was the same woman who'd left me without a word, and now she thought she deserved some kind of recognition for not destroying me financially? Like I should be thanking her for holding back. I finally said, "So what? Am I supposed to be grateful? Grateful that you only left me and didn't try to take my house and everything else with you?" She stared at me, her face a mix of anger, guilt, and something else I couldn't quite place. But by that point, I didn't care anymore. I was done. All those years of guilt, self-doubt, and wondering if I'd been the one to drive her away, they evaporated right then and there. I saw her clearly for the first time, and it felt like a weight I'd been dragging around had finally lifted. But she wasn't done yet. She started pacing on my porch, ranting about how I'd never find someone like her and how I'd regret not giving her another chance. She actually tried to spin it like I was the one losing out by not taking her back. It was surreal. Here was the person who'd torn my life apart, acting like I should be the one begging for her forgiveness. When she realized I wasn't budging, she got louder. She accused me of forcing her to leave, claiming that if I'd been more understanding about the kid's situation, none of this would have happened. According to her twisted logic, my inability to give her a child made me a failure as a husband, and that somehow justified her running off to have a baby with someone else. The mental gymnastics were honestly impressive. I couldn't believe she was trying to pin her choices on me. I told her, "If you wanted a kid that badly, you should have told me the truth. You didn't have to lie and pretend everything was fine while you planned your escape." She just stood there, silent, like I'd slapped her with my words. But I wasn't finished. "You made your choice," I said, "and now you have to live with it. That's on you, not me." She tried one last tactic, putting on her sad face again and pleading with me to think about the baby. She said I was being unfair to him by shutting them out, like I was somehow responsible for this child she brought into the world. She even held the baby closer, using him as a prop to try and guilt me into feeling bad. But I wasn't falling for it. I told her, "I don't know that child. He's not mine, and neither are you. This isn't my problem anymore." And with that, it was done. It finally hit her. She realized I wasn't going to change my mind, that there was no way she'd worm her way back into my life. I saw the anger in her eyes fade, replaced by something else. Maybe real regret, maybe just frustration. But whatever it was, it didn't matter. To me, she was just a stranger now. A stranger who thought she could trample over me and expect me to smile and thank her for it. She lingered there for a few more seconds, like she was waiting for me to change my mind, to call her back. But I didn't say a word. I stood my ground and watched as the truth of the situation sank in. When it finally dawned on her that I meant every word I'd said, I shut the door without a second glance. This time, I didn't wait for her to start banging on it again. I knew, deep down, that my decision was final. There was no turning back. I walked away from that door with a sense of victory, like I'd finally taken control of something that had controlled me for far too long. She had spent years believing she could waltz back into my life, but it was over. I was done. I was free. There wasn't going to be a second chance. Not for her, not for us. She was just a memory now, one I could finally leave behind. After all the guilt, all the pain, and all the wondering, I could finally breathe again. And let me tell you, it felt good. The moment I closed that door, a calmness washed over me. I wasn't angry or sad or even shocked anymore. All the energy I'd wasted on her, the regret, the guilt, the endless questions, it was like it all just dissolved. I'd gotten the closure I didn't even know I needed. It was over, truly over. But, of course, it couldn't end that cleanly. A few days later, I got a text from her mom. She apologized, said she was ashamed of how her daughter had handled things, and mentioned that she tried to talk some sense into her. It was clear her mom felt bad about everything. She was a good person. She'd been there for me when her daughter first left. But I wasn't about to get pulled back into that mess. I sent her a polite reply, "Thanks for checking in." That was it. I wasn't about to explain myself or go into details. She understood enough to know it was done. Over the next few weeks, I started hearing bits and pieces through mutual friends and social media. Apparently, she'd moved back in with her parents, and things weren't going well. The guy she'd left me for, the kid's father, was out of the picture. He'd bailed completely. I guess he wasn't ready for the long haul, and now she was stuck figuring it all out on her own. She'd burned a lot of bridges, and there weren't many people left willing to help her. Even her old friends, the ones who'd sided with me when she disappeared, wanted nothing to do with her drama. They'd all moved on and weren't eager to get dragged back into the chaos. Honestly, I couldn't blame them. Her parents weren't thrilled either. They weren't in a great place financially, and now they were stuck supporting her and the baby. I found this out firsthand when I got a call from her dad not long after the text from her mom. At first, I wasn't going to answer, but curiosity got the better of me. He was polite but to the point. He explained that they were struggling to make ends meet and hinted that maybe I could help out. "We know you cared about her once," he said, before launching into a spiel about the baby and how hard things were for them. I listened politely, but when he started talking about how his daughter just needs a little support to get back on her feet, I couldn't help but chuckle to myself. Not out loud, but still. I told him as kindly as I could, her choices were her own. I'm not in any position to help. I think he got the message because he didn't push the issue further. But then the strangest thing happened. Her old friends started reaching out to me. People I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly wanted to reconnect. A few of her friends tried to guilt me, saying she was going through a tough time and that maybe I could find it in my heart to give her another shot. One even had the nerve to suggest that the kid needed a father figure and that I shouldn't let my bitterness get in the way of helping him out. But I didn't budge. I wasn't about to let anyone make me feel guilty for finally choosing myself. For years, I'd given that woman everything I had, and she'd thrown it away like it meant nothing. The least she could do was take responsibility for her own choices instead of expecting me to swoop in and save her. Eventually, the calls and messages slowed down. Over time, they stopped completely. It seemed like everyone finally got the message. I was serious. I'd moved on, and no amount of guilt-tripping was going to drag me back into that mess. And that's when I felt it. Real peace. My life finally felt quiet, normal in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I had my routines, my friends, and my work. It wasn't anything flashy, but it was mine. Every piece of it. I'd rebuilt on my own terms. Funny enough, I started finding joy in the little things again. Things I hadn't even noticed when I was married. I'd take walks, try out new recipes, read books I'd been meaning to get to forever. The freedom was like a breath of fresh air, and I realized I didn't need anyone's approval to live my life the way I wanted. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't constantly worried about someone else's happiness or expectations. It felt like I'd finally reclaimed my life, piece by piece. Every now and then, I'd run into someone who knew both of us, and they'd ask, "Hey, whatever happened to her?" I'd keep my answer short and polite before changing the subject. It wasn't that I was hiding anything. I just didn't feel like rehashing a chapter of my life that was long since closed. She was part of my past, and that's exactly where she belonged. As for her, last I heard, things weren't going too well. She was struggling to keep a steady job, bouncing between her parents' house and friends' couches whenever she wore out her welcome. Every so often, someone I barely talked to anymore would message me, saying she was asking anyone and everyone for help. Some even hinted she was holding out hope that I'd change my mind, that I'd decide to step in and play dad to her kid. But that wasn't going to happen. I'd worked too hard to rebuild my life to even consider going down that road. I wasn't her safety net, and I wasn't going to clean up the mess she'd made of her own life. That chapter was over. Period. In the end, I felt like I finally got the closure I'd been searching for all along. She'd made her choices, and now she had to live with them. And me? I felt free, truly, completely free in a way I hadn't since the day she walked out of my life. I wasn't letting her shadow hang over me anymore. I'd moved on, and while I wasn't shouting my happiness from the rooftops, I'd found a quiet, peaceful kind of contentment. And you know what? That was more than enough. Thanks for watching. Rate the story in the comments. Subscribe to the channel,